Welcome to Trial Site News Podcast Series. My name is Adrian, and today we have a guest, Dr. Jayne Morgan, who will be talking with us about the inequities and obstacles for patient participation. Now, Trial Site News is committed to the cause of equity in clinical research, ensuring that clinical research participants and sites, investigators, and patients reflect the great diverse people that make up the country. One of our founders has extensive experience in the patient recruitment process and has found that many patterns of inequity have remained the same 2 decades after he was involved with one of the largest patient recruitment ventures in the United States. Trial Site News commissioned a survey of African American participation in clinical research in Southeast Texas and found that nearly all who participated expressed interest in understanding how clinical trials could potentially help loved ones who may be diagnosed with a particular condition. There are historical issues that affect trust and patient engagement within the African American community and biopharmaceutical sponsors and health systems and even government health agencies. Hence, when a group of African American cardiologists got together in Atlanta to discuss disparities in health care, we covered that event and in the process had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Jayne Morgan. Currently a physician with Piedmont Partners, we are honored to have her with us here today for the Trial Site News podcast. So Dr. Morgan, welcome.
Thank you, Adrian. It's a pleasure.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. Now, before we deep dive into the topic at hand, can you share a little bit with us about you? How did you get interested in medicine?
Yes, sure. So I am a native Atlantan, grew up here, and have had a long history, a long time interest, I guess, in going into medicine. Went to Spelman College and then Michigan State for medical school and George Washington University for my internal medicine residency and then Mount Sinai for cardiology. Practiced for several years and transitioned over into industry, meaning working in corporate America within the pharmaceutical and device industry. And have been at Piedmont for nearly 5 years, initially running and expanding their cardiovascular research program, and in the last 2 years have expanded into their Office of Innovation. So I do not see patients. I do not have a patient-facing practice. My practice is has always been, for the last 10 years, all research-based. With clinical trials or drug and device development within the pharmaceutical industry at both Solvay and Abbott.
So you said for the last 10 years you've been focused on clinical research. What raised your interest on the research side of healthcare?
I would say for the past 10 years I've been focused on it exclusively, but for the past, since 2004.
Oh, wow.
So maybe for the past 15 years, I've been working directly in research clinical trials, either in R&D for cardiorenal indications or R&D meaning research and development, or in the medical affairs arena, meaning working on communication, the results of trials, or in business development where we are looking to expand indications, meaning expand the reach and the breadth of any drug or device that we're developing.
Sounds like that's where your passion then lies.
It's true. It's something that I really enjoy, and I came to Piedmont Healthcare System in Atlanta just for that reason, to be able to live my passion and express that joy, leading the cardiovascular research program. Was very successful in building that program and continuing to grow it and developing a feasibility program, expanding to other hospital locations that we have within the system. And so it really is something that's near and dear to my heart.
Well, we're grateful for people like you that care about this and care about being involved in it. And so shifting then, we know that there are inequities in access to advanced clinical trials, whether it be oncology or cardiology or other therapeutic areas. Can you share some of your experiences and thoughts as to how African Americans can be more engaged in clinical research?
It's a big challenge currently. Traditionally, we have a paucity of enrolled African Americans, minority groups in general, within clinical trials. And The problem with that is that we develop drugs, specifically drugs, but drugs and devices on populations that don't represent our population and that may or may not then be relevant to our disease processes.
Right.
And so it becomes quite a challenge, because when FDA approves these drugs and approves these indications, what really happens is that when they are prescribed to the African American population or other minority populations, it's really an extrapolation, meaning this is what the trial showed. Even though you were not enrolled or adequately represented in this trial, we're going to assume that the effects are the same for you. Therefore, we are going to prescribe it in this manner, which may or may not be relevant. And so we really have to be able to understand the importance of accessing clinical trials, understand that accessing clinical trials is accessing health care. It is the optimal cherry on top of the sundae of accessing health care. You need to be engaged in clinical trials such that you can be represented for any drug development or any research outcomes, and such that those outcomes are relevant to you and can help you increase your longevity, meaning how long you live, and decrease your morbidity, meaning that the amount of suffering that you have with different disease processes that you're managing.
So what obstacles then do you think are in the way today to more access and participation?
So there's several obstacles. One is that principal investigators of trials generally don't reflect the African American culture. Mm-hmm. And so there's not really that degree of cultural sensitivity, or there's a cultural naivete in approaching African American patients to talk about possible enrollment and inclusion in these trials. Additionally, what I've found is that, and what research has shown, I think this is fairly well published, that you're more likely to participate or seriously consider involvement in a clinical trial, not when a family member is encouraging it or a friend is encouraging it, but when your physician reaches out to you and relays to you that this is important and that they are supporting it. You are much more likely with a trusted physician to access these clinical trials and participate in clinical trials. And we find that physicians are disconnected from academic centers, from large medical centers where these clinical trials are generally ongoing. And so we start there with the physicians who have the opportunity to serve as principal investigators, meaning the lead physician of a trial. Those physicians, by and large, are not African American. And the African American population of physicians generally does not access this for their patients and does not have a lot of experience or exposure to it as well. And so that becomes really an issue. And I think what gets at that issue is, just traditionally, there has not been a lot of inclusion or outreach. Research, clinical trials, innovation in general has not been an inclusive area. But we are finding that diversity is going to be important. We have trials, all of us. We have trials where we're gathering information. It's called All of Us, where it's going to be important to understand the heterogeneity of the population, especially as we move increasingly more towards A, population health, and B, personalized medicine. That it's going to be important that we have representation, that we have adequate representation, and that we develop drugs and devices that are relevant to our health issues and can maximally treat our disease processes based on how our body or composition or chemical makeup, if you will, has developed. And all of those are small nuances. And so, part of that is genomics, meaning what is your genetic makeup and how does your genetic profile differ from the next person? And so if the next person has a drug that's developed based on their profile, is that really relevant to you if you didn't participate in a clinical trial? And can that drug actually do more harm than good? And so these are all questions and all factors that have to be considered. Absolutely. One of the other arenas is that patients themselves have a lack of trust of the healthcare system in general. It has not always been a favorable healthcare system. There certainly have been many egregious acts that have occurred against the African American population in the name of research. And there is a reticence to voluntarily be involved when there was a long history of involuntary participation in research programs and research trials that were very malignant and purposefully malignant.
Yeah.
And so this is a long history of this distrust. And so if you talk about the distrust of the African American population and patient with the health system, the disconnect of the physicians who represent us, and by and large, 90% of African American patients are seen by African American physicians, and those physicians are disconnected from the system as well, then you can see how this all begins to feed on itself.
Oh, absolutely.
One of the other areas that we have found is medical centers, large medical centers and academic institutions do not have African Americans in leadership positions within their institutions as well. And so even at that level, without being included, without having a voice at the table, these types of situations continue to emanate. And without leadership moving it forward, then it also becomes very difficult to make any inroads and begin to make any adjustments. And then one of the last aspects is the clinical research coordinators, the nurses, who actually interact on a much more frequent basis with the patient. Those people generally need to speak in a culturally sensitive and nuanced way, understand what's not being said as well as what's being said. And in general, when we look at those roles as well, traditionally, we do not see African Americans in general holding those positions in research.
Right, which would then directly correlate with a lack of clinical trial participation. I mean,
no one speaks my language.
Right. So related to this then, and I think it's important to note that you were quoted in our article posted back in December, which we titled African Americans in Atlanta Discuss the Need for Black Participation in Cardiovascular-Based Clinical Trials, where you talked about, for example, the dirty little secret that those enrolled in research trial find that most of the medical care is free. And obviously this is not commonly known. Can you expand on that? And for those that may not know about this.
Right. And I think, access to healthcare is a big issue in America. And access to healthcare by minority communities is, incredibly magnified. One of the areas in which access to healthcare becomes more accessible is via clinical trial. If you qualify for a clinical trial and are enrolled in a clinical trial, you have multiple visits with your physician. So you have an increased number of touch points with the healthcare system. So that one increases your ability and opportunity to be healthy and to have important conversations with healthcare physicians or other healthcare providers. The research visits are covered by the sponsor, meaning the pharmaceutical or drug company. These are not billed to insurance companies. So for all of those research visits, those visits are not at the cost of the patient. And then other visits that you have that may or may not be a part of the research program, oftentimes those visits are also billed to your insurance company. If you don't have insurance, there are oftentimes many options, especially if you qualify for the trial, for you to continue to come in via the trial and receive medical care, because it's important for you to receive medical care for the duration of that trial, such that the company and the FDA can have adequate and accurate data on you. If you withdraw from the trial or drop out of the trial or are an inconsistent participant, then that invalidates much of your data, and that is not helpful to what the FDA is trying to do in ensuring the safety of the American population, and it's not helpful to drug and device companies who are trying to develop drugs to improve health. And so it's actually to your advantage if you're having difficulty accessing health care or are underinsured. Access to clinical trials is an avenue for you to be inside of the medical establishment.
Yeah, which is really important for more people to know, and especially those in low-income environments.
Right.
So then let's look forward then to the future. Now, we appreciate Piedmont's healthcare commitment to its whole community. How can health systems develop clinical research programs that help offer more dynamic access to research care options?
Yeah, and I think it's a multifaceted question. Oftentimes, and not so much in Atlanta, which is where I am, but the state of Georgia, lots of rural areas throughout the entire Southeast, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas. One of the challenges that we find is that people without a lot of resources, and oftentimes that does include the African American population, just getting to your doctor's appointment is a challenge. You don't have a car. You don't have access to transportation. The travel time may be greater than 2 hours in one direction. You may not be able to take off from work to do that because if you have 2 hours to get to the physician, that's really your entire day of work. You're traveling there. You are going to your physician and your appointments, and then you're traveling back home. That is a day of work that you have to take off. Many people are not able to do that. Many people don't have the resources as well, to get back and forth with frequency. And so they may come initially for a doctor's appointment, but it's very difficult to come for follow-up appointments. And so, when we begin to look at all of these, how do you expand into rural areas and have a reach across the region for access to rural health? How do clinical trials and drug companies and device companies begin to access these physicians that work in rural areas such that they can become involved in research trials and run these trials and their enrollment out of their office? The physicians do receive some remuneration and some payment as well if they receive the adequate training for research for their effort in supporting, the advancement of science. And so it's a win-win for everyone, and yet, there's so many social determinants of health and so many socioeconomic issues that make it very challenging. The food deserts and, not having fresh produce within 5 or 6 miles of your home, that type of thing makes it challenging. And just getting to a doctor's appointment starts to become a lower priority when food is a higher priority or your utilities becomes a higher priority.
Yeah, it's that choice of which one do I go with.
That's right.
So then what kinds of forums or programs or other engagement initiatives do you think would be transformative for broad-based access and engagement with traditionally underserved communities in biotech and pharma companies?
That's a great question, something that I have pondered. I think that it really needs to start with the physicians in our community. Mm-hmm. And, the physicians have an incredible reach and an incredible amount of influence. And we've got to, healthcare facilities, medical centers, academic centers have got to begin to actively bridge that gap, to bring physicians in who have this huge cadre of patients and have them be involved as leaders in clinical trial, and then begin to discuss as a trusted physician in that patient-doctor relationship the importance of clinical trials, or a clinical trial that he or she has identified that would be important for that patient. The discussion begins there. And I think in open discussion as well, I think we have to, absolutely address Tuskegee experiment, Henrietta Lacks, Juneteenth. We can't ignore the elephant in the room and still ask the African-American population, to trust us and bring us into research. I recognize that I am a red herring in this area. You don't see many African-Americans, involved in research, and definitely not to the depth and the passion. And my career has been built around research. And yet I don't have a clinical practice. So my role would be to influence my colleagues who are seeing patients clinically to become involved, and then to also work with drug and pharmaceutical companies to help them understand how to best access diverse populations, because it's going to be important not only for these populations, but for all drug makers and device developers, that it has to be relevant to an entire demographic, an entire population, and America is very diverse. The world is quite diverse.
Yes.
Most of these companies build, when they're developing drugs, their thought is not to build them for one slice of a population, but they are going to apply for patents and protection all over the world. The drugs are going to be available globally. And so it's important then for that global population to be represented in their trial. And that's why you will see drug companies conduct trials in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, China, South America, for that very reason. They need to have representation because they plan to have a distribution that is worldwide, not for a simple narrow demographic. And if they don't do that, if they develop a drug for a narrow demographic, you run the risk of that drug providing deleterious effects to some people with unexpected results that didn't come out in your clinical trial because they weren't represented.
Right, and that causes all sorts of issues down the road.
That causes a lot of issues, a lot of regulatory issues. That's a big cost for companies as well. And it's a big cost for patients who could be harmed, even if they are just mild side effects. So, for instance, you take a new drug and, you develop nausea, or you develop a mild nosebleed. In general, those are innocuous events, but they are still unpleasant enough that you will not follow up and continue to be compliant with taking that medication. And then, of course, more severe things could happen. Those are the types of things that we want to be exposed during a clinical trial under a controlled situation where we're carefully managing and monitoring every patient, as opposed to the drug being approved and going out into the world. And then we're starting to get real world information back that was not uncovered during our clinical trial. So it's important for there to be representation of everyone. It's important for medical facilities and academic institutions to have representation in leadership for their research. And it's important for African American physicians to be involved in research, to develop those connections and lines of communications with academic centers and medical centers, such that they can begin then to present it to their patients.
Right, which is why what you're doing is so important. So, well, we want to thank you and Piedmont Healthcare for taking the time to speak with Trial Site News. Thank you so much for joining us.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Adrian.